people really don't understand the arc of what's happened on the committee over many years. So let me talk briefly about that, what started where we are today. We're often, we're usually, amongst conservatives, we're considered the big problem. We're the committee that spends too much, does too much, and somehow solely responsible for the national debt. I always like to tell, history for me in Congress begins with the arrival of Al Rogers. Al Rogers and Ronald Reagan get here the same year, 1981. And that year, when the most legendary appropriator that we have, the Dean of the House, begins his career, we appropriate 45% of the federal budget and 9.8% of the GDP of the richest country in the world. Today, we appropriate 26% of the federal budget and 6.4% of the GDP of the richest country in the world. So the real history of the last 40 years hasn't been on appropriation. It's been the steady expansion of entitlement spending because honestly, folks, in my view, until this year, and I really want to give my friend Brett Guthrie a lot of credit, since '83, nobody's touched entitlement spending until this year in the big beautiful bill. And changing the arc of Medicaid, we still have, Medicaid, yeah, have Medicare and Social Security to deal with, are really the most important pressing problems of Congress. If appropriations were the spending problem, it would not have held spending flat for 10 years, which it did from FY 2010 to FY 2019. If you go back and look, you'll actually see in 2019, we were spending less money on defense than we were in 2010, and we were spending less money on non-defense, on the appropriated budget. The whole thing is driven by the retirement of the baby boom generation, aging population, and frankly, the inability and unwillingness of either party to do anything on entitlement spending ever. And so to finally actually do something, which we did in the big beautiful bill, was really historic. Now, we also do a lot of every Ways and Means chairman I know, and they've been great chairmen, tries to make their mark by, if you're a Republican, by cutting taxes. Now, nobody thinks about balancing the budget. We don't pay for tax cuts, and we do lots of tax expenditures, quite frankly. So if you want to be the real root of the deficit problem, not on our committee. It really is under the, it's all the places we don't have jurisdiction. And I say that just to set us up where we are now. We came in, I came into office because Kay Granger left early, and obviously we were on the eve of an election, and nothing's going to get done too much. And that election really shook up the Democrats like no election I've ever seen. And while it's a joke that every Democrat is seized by Trump derangement syndrome, I can tell you it's actually true. They really have a very hard time dealing with the President of the United States. We should have gotten an approach deal, frankly, before Donald Trump became president. The framework had already been negotiated by Speaker McCarthy and the Biden administration. We're supposed to have a 1% increase in spending, and then frankly we had people at the table. You've got a Rosa DeLaura, you've got a Patty Murray, you've got a Susan Collins, and hopefully myself amongst those three. You have people that know how to get things done and work together and usually come to deals. But we couldn't finish a deal between the election and the inauguration of President Trump, largely because our own side was worried if we had a deal, we would have a motion to vacate. So you had to get the speaker in, and that meant you couldn't do anything before January 3rd. And then we got a new president coming, and we're trying to get a deal done. And we actually eventually get to a top line. There should have been a deal. Once you get a top line, the rest of it will usually fall into place. What happened, and what sets us up for this cycle, and I'll get a lot more current, is once Donald Trump became president of the United States, you immediately saw a blizzard of executive orders and DOGE. And Democrats are going crazy. Not to mention, they've lost everything. They don't have the presidency, they don't have the Senate, they don't have the House. And it's a frustrating place. I've been there before, And I understand how difficult that is on a party that, going into the election, had both the executive branch and the United States Senate, and frankly, found it almost incomprehensible to their leadership that they could lose to Donald Trump a second time. So they're pretty stunned. Then you get all this blizzard of orders, and then we start getting demands from the other side. Well, we have to put limits on what a Republican president can do in the executive branch. And I'm looking across the table, I've got Susan Collins with me. I said, let me get this straight. You want a Republican Senate and a Republican House to limit a Republican president whose name is Donald Trump and who has to sign the bill? Yeah. I said, that ain't gonna happen. You know, that will never, ever happen. We are not in the business of sending a Republican president appropriations bills that he will not sign. And if Susan Collins and I do that, and we were like, what? I mean, she's a wonderful negotiating partner. I mean, I've negotiated a lot with Rosa DeLore and Patty Murray over the years, because for 8 years, we were 3 of the 4 corners with Roy Blunt on the labor age bill. We always got a deal done. So I know them, I respect them, we disagree on issues, but I will tell you they're tough, talented, but honest and fair negotiators. And Susan Collins is very much that same mold. I said, so if we do this, you won't be negotiating next week with Susan Collins and me. There'll be somebody new here, and you're not gonna like them nearly as much as us. And if you can't make a deal with Susan Collins and me, who the hell do you think you're gonna make a deal with out of the Republican caucus in either place?
That's true.
But they kept insisting, and quite honestly, they didn't think we could do a CR. And as I told one of them, you know the 2 names, I'm not gonna attribute the one, I said, we really can pass this CR. I know you think we're crazy, and I know our margins are small, but if I can go back to my caucus and say, as we will in a CR, I can cut spending and increase defense in the same bill, and that'll be a CR, then we'll pass it. And we did. And then one of them said, well, if you do pass it, before we did it, he said, you know, and the government shuts down, you'll get the blame, because you always get the blame. And I said, we always get the blame because we usually deserve the blame. But this time around, if you don't think there's already placards in this town someplace printed up talking about the Schumer shutdown, you're crazy. We get it out of here, it's going to the United States Senate. 53 of us, you gotta have 60 to get there. It'll be clear. Either you shut it down or, or you pass it. One or the other, it's up to you. And, there's a lot of bravado, but in the end, Senator Schumer did what President Trump said at the time was the right thing and the smart thing. The right thing was to keep the government open for the American people. The smart thing was not to shut it down, then have to come back and reopen it 3 weeks later with nothing to show for it. We've done that twice. The Democrats shut down the government, which they did, people forget it, over DACA for 2 days. Now, they shut it down on Friday and reopened on Monday. When Republicans do something stupid, we're really stubborn about it. We're gonna hang in there for 16 days, for 35 days. We're gonna fight and prove how wrong this really is, this strategy. Democrats thought, hey, this is a losing deal, we're getting out of here. But it always ends that way. And it'll end that way if we stumble into another shutdown at the end of this month. Who's ever perceived as being responsible will get the blame. And over whatever issue, it won't matter, because as soon as the government shut down, that issue disappears and the discussion becomes who shut down the government, why, and when are they going to open it again. And every single day, more people get inconvenienced, more people get mad, more people get upset, and you find yourself in a terrible position. So when Schumer did the right thing and the smart thing, and he did both in my opinion, and we don't agree on a lot of things, but I think he did the right thing for his party and for the country. What happened? And this is going to get to the roots of the real dilemma we've got right now. The guy does the right thing and the smart thing. He drops 12 points amongst Democrats in New York. He picks up a potential primary opponent in AOC. He picks up a potential leadership opponent, probably in Chris Murphy right now, if he's looking what he's doing on approach, but somebody. And he's thrown under the bus by his own party in the House, led by his own friend, a fellow New Yorker, who, of course, you know, didn't have to worry about having to respond. They put up every vote they had, vote no, and no, they wouldn't get the blame because they didn't have the decisive votes. He had a different dilemma, and he was hammered. So if you went through what he went through, would you come to a deal now or not? And there's actually a serious debate on the Democratic Party. Maybe we need to shut down the government to show them that we're fighting, to show our own people that we're fighting. I've lived this before, and I've had this discussion with friends of mine on the other side, both the House and the Senate. I said, it's exactly the dilemma that John Boehner had in 2013 over Obamacare. I mean, stop and think back to that period. I remember I was a Boehner intimate during that period. And I was telling you, this is crazy. Why are we doing this? And our own people said, well, we'll shut down the government. And by shutting down the government, we'll make a guy named Obama sign a repeal bill of something called Obamacare. And if he doesn't, we'll override him in the Senate, where we had 46 members. And nobody could ever give me the magic list of the 21 Democrats who would flip to override Obama. And yet, that's what we went to do. You know, as I'm talking to, Boehner thought the shutdown would last about 3 or 4 days, went on about 16. And we got hammered. He said, Tom, I've got to teach them a lesson. And this is, they want to fight, and I got to lead them in the fight, or my own leadership will be at risk. We're going to lose. And so, you know, we're moving up on that kind of moment again. And I find eerily, I look at particularly Senator Schumer, and I think he's kind of in the same spot that John Boehner was in. He's got an irrational base that just wants to fight Trump. And honestly, and I mentioned this in committee yesterday, I've got some really good Democrats, some very thoughtful people, and one of them asked an interesting question, had an interesting amendment, and we had a long discussion on where we needed to go to get to a deal. And I told him, I said, you know, at the end of the day, you have to have a deal that the President of the United States can sign. And we know you have to have something, because we need your votes. You know, we can't get it across the Senate without Democratic votes. The minute we hit 60 in the Senate, I lose 30 in the House immediately. So even if I pass something out like a CR very narrowly on a partisan vote, final deal requires Democrats in the Senate, and that means I lose Republicans in the House, so I gotta have Democrats. So I always work hard to keep a good relationship with Rosa DeLauro, and frankly with my Democratic members insofar as I can in general. Because sooner or later, I'm gonna need them to get a final product across the floor. So where are we at right now? The committee has moved along pretty well, but we can't look at ourselves in isolation. We have to look at what's happening in the Senate. In the House, we've now gotten 10 of the 12 bills done. We got one yesterday. We'll hopefully bring another one across the floor today, energy and water. We've gotten 2 across the floor, defense and MilCon. Those are over 60% of all spending. And then this one will bring it up to close to 2/3. And once we get every bill out of committee, and we'll get the next 2 out next week, then we can go to conference. The Senate, and I really want to compliment both Senator Collins and Senator Murray, they pursue a different strategy. We're at a stage, we're majority owned. You know, these are Republican bills that have to pass out with Republican votes. We're a majoritarian institution. There will come a time to negotiate and collaborate. It's not now. That doesn't matter if we're running it or the Democrats are running it. I've been in the minority. They weren't negotiating with us at this stage either. They get their product through. The Senate has started, in a very bipartisan way, where they come to agreements and they're starting to move bills. This is the first time in 7 years the United States Senate has moved a bill across the floor, an approach bill, before September. And I give Thune a lot of credit for that. Honestly, Schumer didn't like appropriations bills. He wanted one big deal because it maximized the majority leader's power. So everything was driven toward having some sort of omnibus at the end. They now have 3 vehicles, one of which we've also moved, Milcon VA. So we can go to conference, and they've got 2 other bills they passed, Ledge Branch and Ag, where honestly, Ledge Branch is basically the Senate does what they want to do, we do what we want to do. There's a common concern, like this year could be security. Leadership tells us we want to do X. But that's a pretty easy bill to pass. Ag, tougher, but we're only a couple $1 billion apart. So if you put those 3 bills together, we don't have a top line yet, that's a whole other problem. But you could take the Senate top line and our top line and negotiate between the 2 and actually move those bills across the floor in a bipartisan way, both the Senate and the House. And then you could attach to that some sort of CR, not a long-term one, certainly not a year-long CR, but a CR to buy time so you could avoid all the drama around September 30th. You know, funding is into November or something like that. Now the White House is talking about even having a CR that stretches into the first quarter of next year. You certainly could finish all the work in there. But to do it, you've got to have members that recognize it's going to be a compromise. That's really where we're at now. We could have a shutdown, in which case I think the Democrats would regret it, because I think if we get something out of the House or the president puts on the table, I'll sign a clean CR for X amount of time to give you guys a chance to finish up your work. And you shut down the government instead. I think they still have the problem that they had before. You shut down the government for what? What was the purpose? I will tell you, in the other shutdowns we've had, as stupid as they were, there was always an objective. The objective in the 13 shutdown was we're going to repeal Obamacare. We didn't, but this is what we're trying to do. The objective in DACA was we're going to force a change in DACA law. They weren't able to do it, but they had an objective. The objective in the 18 through 2019 shutdown was we're going to finish the wall. We didn't, but yet, what would the objective have been last year, and what will it be this year? You see the Democrats are trying to find an objective. Now it's going to be health care. We're going to force a change in an unrelated bill, the big beautiful bill on Medicare. Really? You think that's going to happen? Has nothing to do with appropriations, no connection with appropriations, it won't work. Again, we'll see what the Democrats want to do, but they're smart. They'll come to a deal. And the deal, again, is a compromise, but it's got to be a deal Donald Trump is willing to sign. It can't, the idea that we will have the Congress of the United States, which is run by Republicans, take on the Republican president of the United States, because the Democrats feel bad about that. That ain't happening. I mean, that's just, you're trying to do something that cannot occur. You want to have a check on spending, go win the next election. I mean, right now, you've got votes, you've got cards to play, but you don't have the ability to force us to take on the President of the United States because you're mad at him. And that's really where we're at. So do they sober up? Because we're going to move our bills through. Patty Murray and Susan Collins have already shown they know how to move legislation. They're moving it across the floor, they're moving it early, and Thune's given them more runway than Schumer ever gave any appropriators. Remember last year when Schumer was majority leader, they didn't pass a single bill on the floor of the Senate. Not one appropriations bill came to the floor. If they'd have done one, since we could negotiate from all 12, we actually could have gone to conference and carved out a deal and avoided a CR. So I think we're better positioned in terms of leadership. I think the Democrats have the same issue. And I think we're closer together than most people realize. Let me just end with this and I'll take a question. If you read the Washington press, you would assume that somehow the House is riding at ridiculously low levels of spending. That we are riding basically on the so-called skinny budget or the OMB budget. And look, I'm for cutting spending. We actually did it last year. Last year, because we did not get the 1% increase, there's $18 billion, and we did not get any congressional projects, because you don't get them in a CR. there's another $13 billion, 14. We actually cut spending net by about $25 billion. We're spending $25 billion less in FY25 than we did in FY24 discretionary budget. And we have written a budget and are passing a budget where it's $45 billion beyond that in the appropriations bills. But OMB's budget is $163 billion beyond. So we're not quite as far apart as people think. And it really is going to get down to, does our leadership on both sides want to have a deal? If they want to have a deal, we can get a deal. If they don't want to have a deal, we can do all the motions and all the things we want, and we won't get to a deal. And the deal requires two things. The deal requires, one, a top line. We don't have that. Top line on the House side should come from the Budget Committee, which should write a budget with a 302A in there, our top spending line for discretionary, pass it through Congress. Those two things did not happen. I do not have that. Or a budget can come if the President of the United States and the legislative leadership on both sides agree to a number. I can mark to that. That hadn't happened yet. It'd be premature for it to happen at this point. Or we could have the Speaker and the Pro Tem, since they're both in the same party, agree to a common number. I can mark to that. None of that had happened. So all I got is, Cole, what do you think you can mark to that you can actually pass through your committee and have a chance on the floor? And that's where we're at right now. That number is a number that, if you're in the Senate, you're going to want to compromise between your number and our number. It's got to move up. But we're not in a place with a gap that we can't cross. We just have to, people have to decide, I'm better off with a deal than I am with a CR, let alone a shutdown followed by a CR, which, you know, is certainly a possibility. But we just need politicians to act like politicians instead of ideologues. You know, I always tell folks, if you want to be, you know, president of the Progressive Caucus, or chairman of the Progressive Caucus, or the Freedom Caucus, that's great. That's a wonderful ambition. There's a role. But if you actually want to get something done, those aren't the positions you're going to get them done from. You can make a point, you're not going to make a difference. If you want to make a difference, you got to be responsible. And for this to work, since it's got to be bipartisan, we're coming out of a period where in the Congress, because of the big beautiful bill, that's reconciliation, that's shirts and skins. You know, we don't need any Democrats to do a reconciliation bill. I got to have them to do an appropriations bill. So if you can't bargain, and the others, and understand the other person has to get something that they want, and you have to give something up that you would prefer not to give, then you're in the wrong business. You know, you certainly can't be an appropriator. So anyway, we think we've found the right balance. We think we have the right negotiating partners. But I've got to have leadership in both chambers and both parties, and an administration that thinks a deal is better than a CR. And believe me, it is better than a CR. And is willing to recognize the other party has to get something. It's like the oldest kind of let's make a deal politics. That's what appropriations is all about. But it's apparently sometimes a lost art these days. That's not the first time. It was a lost art in 2013 too. And it came back the next year, and we actually moved on and found ways to work through the Obama years and even through the Trump years. So I'm hoping for an outbreak of sanity between now and the end of the month. And I see signs. I see hopeful signs. I see the Senate moving bills. I see very capable negotiators on the other side. I see, you know, honestly, an administration that wasn't too concerned with last year because they thought that was a Biden CR. And they were right. Now that's their time. And I think there will be some people arguing for CR. There'll be others arguing, let's make a deal. We want new starts. We want to make changes. We got things we want to get done. And we don't want to shut down.